Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here for this presentation of the benefits of nesting platforms for Western Cordilleran Flycatchers in Southwest Colorado and Mount Lemmon, Arizona. Our presenter today is Dr. Charles Van Riper III. Dr. Van Riper is currently an Emeritus Professor at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Arizona. That's where I got my environmental sciences degree from. And he's also an Emeritus ST Ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey Southwest Biological Science Center for the Department of the Interior. Dr. Van Riper is the author of over 300 scientific papers, as well as 28 books, and is the editor on a series of 11 books about the Colorado Plateau, a series published by the University of Arizona Press. He is a past president of the Wildlife Disease Association and was on the editorial board for the Journal of Wildlife Diseases, as well as the Condor. Dr. Van Riper began his bird research in Hawaii, working on the impact of introduced parasites on native Hawaiian birds, with a focus on malaria and avian pox. His present research focuses on neotropical migrant passerine birds in Western North America and their whole annual cycles throughout Mexico and into Central America. I'd also like to point out, we always start off all of our events by telling you why we do this. It's quite simple. Our mission here at Tucson Audubon is inspire people to enjoy and protect birds. And we do that through recreation, education, conservation, and restoration of the environment upon which we all depend. And so today's presentation is going to lean heavily into that educational aspect. I'm very, very excited to hear what Dr. Van Riper has for us today, and I hope you are as well. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Van Riper.
Well, thank you, Danilo, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining us here. I'm going to be talking today about the benefit of nesting platforms that we've been working on Mount Lemmon. And the reason for this presentation was in your last Vermilion Flycatcher issue on nest boxes in the Sonoran Desert that Matt Griffiths did a wonderful job compiling stuff. On page 12, I wrote a short summary article on the platform work we've been doing up on Mount Lemmon and in Southwest Colorado. And then Matt asked me to contact Danilo to set up this whole arrangement, which I very much appreciate. And one of my goals here is to try and give a little bit more detail with some data and science on exactly what we're doing with those platforms. It's sort of providing data and summarizing that article on page 12 in your last Vermilion Flycatcher. I've spent a lot of my career trying to integrate science into resource management activities. That's been one goal I've had. And I guess a goal with this talk is to try to convince the Audubon Society here in Tucson that these nest platforms that we've developed would be useful for them to put in their arsenal of conservation tools. And you'll get a little bit of that in the summary here. And like any scientific study, this is a compilation of a lot of work of a lot of people, and I appreciate all my field technicians, my graduate students and postdocs that have helped with this project, and a lot of the volunteers like Linda and Chris Hansen were helping me last year with the mist netting up on Mount Lemmon. So with that, we'll launch into the presentation today. And as Danilo said, if any of you have questions, just put it in the chat box. I'll try to answer them as best I can when I finish. And you'll only have about 20 minutes here, so it won't be too long, maybe 30 if I babble on too long. So the outline of the presentation today, what I'll do is first provide an introduction and then some methods, the study areas, the birds, distributional pattern, and some of the data collection techniques we used. Then with the results, I'll be presenting how we developed the nesting platforms and the different styles and the experiments we used to test which ones were best. And then move into the actual science of collecting data we've collected on breeding behaviors and aspects of breeding on platforms versus natural nest sites. And we've looked at nest building, incubation, nestling, fledgling patterns in Colorado, and then we'll compare Colorado, Arizona, and then close with end up with the results and discussion on a little bit of benefits and cost up to the Western Cordilleran Flycatcher of using platforms, particularly focusing on predation and reproduction. And then one last short slide on a summary and possible future management aspects. This is part of a larger study that we are conducting right now, looking at full annual cycles of neotropical migrant birds. This one's focused on the Western Cordilleran Flycatcher. And can everybody see this mouse? We're going to be focusing up here in the breeding season. The bird spends 8 months of the year in Mexico, in southern Mexico, and a month going down and a month coming back. So we're only looking at a short time period up here in the early breeding season.
Dr. Van Riper, sorry to jump in. We're still on the opening slide of your presentation.
Okay. All right. I'm moving them, and it's moving on my screen. Let me. Sorry. Maybe I got the wrong.
Yeah, there we go.
Is that it?
Did you?
Does that move?
Well, now click on another slide and see if it moves.
No? Okay, so what's happening is I'm on the wrong screen. Does it move now? Resume slideshow.
I do see your, I can see your cursor.
Right here?
Well, now it's moved. Yeah, right now it's hovering right over the start screen of the presentation.
Okay, so I'm on the wrong screen is what's going on. Does it change now?
There we go. Now it changed.
Okay, so this is the outline of the presentation I just gave.
Perfect.
Sorry. Is it full screen or not?
It's not. If you will hit, you see down in the lower right-hand corner where it says slideshow?
Yeah.
There you go. Click on that and it should maximize it. Well, that's okay. I mean, I think everybody can see fine. I think it works actually nice being able to see you while you're speaking. So,
Yeah. Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
this works great.
Okay. So, all right, I apologize. Okay. So I just talked about the breeding season up in here, and then the 8 months in Mexico. And so what we'll do now is move into the bird itself. That's not what I wanted to do. All right. Okay, we're on the bird now, Danilo?
Yes,
Okay.
sir.
Okay, this is the Cordilleran Flycatcher, or it used to be. It's now Western. It's a small Empidonax flycatcher. It weighs about 10 grams, average. Male's a little bit heavier. So if you had a AA battery in your hand and a Cordilleran Flycatcher, a AAA battery, they weigh about the same, the same thing. So that's how small this thing is. It's a little bit bigger than a hummingbird. They're about 8 grams, but it's not bigger than many other birds. As you all know, and probably are very grateful for, the AOS Taxonomy Committee has just merged these in 2004, taking the Pacific Slope and the Cordilleran and put them back together. A lot of result of Ethan Link's 2017 paper on the genetics of these guys. This bird is a riparian obligate species, which means that they're always found in wet, moist areas usually around water. And it's nest site limited. And you'll hear me say this a lot because a lot of people don't comprehend that this bird is much like a hole nesting species, like bluebirds, wood ducks. They're nest site limited. And one looks at the environment and says, oh, there's a lot of nest sites for these birds. That is not the case. And so that's the whole reason for these nest platforms, is to add more nest sites to the environment to allow greater productivity of the bird. They nest in sheltered cavities, and although not complete holes, these cavities are nest site limited. Previous to our studies, about 80% of the known nests of this particular species have been found on human structures, kind of like Mindy's beam above her head in the background, if you can see Mindy there. And that beam above their heads is a perfect place for Cordilleran to nest. And most of the nests have come from human barns, old cabins and decks and stuff like that. So we began the Colorado study in 2007, and we ended that in 18. And I had a postdoc go to Mount Lemmon in 16 and start a study up there on the same species. And we moved completely from in 18 back down to Mount Lemmon, and we've been working up there every summer throughout this last summer. Now, little was known about the full annual cycle of the species. And so we'd hope collecting information and working with this bird, which is not that rare and endangered, that it would provide information to help for the conservation of other crevice nesting species. The bird itself, you're not going to get my animations on the screen, and I apologize, but the bird has a fairly wide distributional pattern. You can see this. This is from the breeding birds of North America. It goes from southern Mexico all the way up into the border of Canada. Our study areas were in the middle of its breeding range. It has a large breeding population that remains in Mexico and does not migrate. And it's thought that these birds move up and down slope into Sierra Madres. And anybody who's more interested in what the birds do, you know, they occupy the Sky Islands from Tucson down to the Chiricahuas and into Sonora, but they're not found on the lowland habitats. The paper that Harold Greene, a former postdoc of mine, and I wrote for the occasional papers of the Louisiana State University Museum, pretty much outlines in pretty good detail what's known about the Mexico population. So anybody's interested in the birds down there can take a look at that one. Okay. The birds, again, nest in cavities, and here's some of their favorite sites. This one on the left here is a wind-thrown big old dead tree, and the roots stick up in the air, and as long as they have dirt on them, the birds tend to find cavities in those dirts and nest. One of the favorite locations are in the sedimentary rock. When a layer of sedimentary rock breaks off, there's a nest right here where the pointer is. It's hard to see, but it's right in that cavity there. They also take tree bark cavities, like right here, there's a hole in this big old cottonwood in Colorado, and they nested behind the bark, or when dead bark starts hanging off a tree, they'll nest between the bark and the tree. And they nest on man-made structures, as I said previously. This one chose to nest on top of one of our platforms instead of inside of it. So these are the types of cavities they use. If anyone takes the road up on Mount Lemmon just before you hit Summerhaven up to Ski Run, all the way to the summit, you'll see where the road has these cutouts, and there's what used to be sedimentary rock break off there, and then birds really like nesting in those broken off sedimentary rock areas. The methods we used were just fairly straightforward ornithological techniques. We misnetted and color banded the birds. So each bird up there that we have known nesting has a unique color combination. We did breeding, foraging observations. We've attached geolocators to look for long distance migrants and how they migrate into Mexico. And we use transmitters on them on Mount Lemmon and in Colorado to look at local movement patterns, like just fledged young and how adults are feeding fledged young and how that compares back to feeding of nestlings. We also do invertebrate sampling using malaise traps, and I'll explain those in a minute. And we have permanent weather stations at each site, so we can look at weather patterns and correlations of weather patterns to aspects of the breeding biology. So in the geolocators we put on the birds, you see this black unit on the back there? That weighs 0.3 grams. It's about 3% of the total body weight. And that unit collects data, but it does not transmit anything. So we have to recapture the bird. And I've had about 3 of them, males in particular, who will not come down out of the trees until they feed young. And if their nest fails, I can't catch them. breaks my heart. But we've got, we deployed 72, and this is another part of the aspect of the study in the migration pattern of the birds. But we color band all birds. The males have a metal band on the right leg and color bands on the left. The females have a metal USGS government metal band on the left leg and color patterns on the right leg. So initially we can say, is it a male or female? Because they are monomorphic. They're really hard to tell apart unless you have a micrometer and you can measure the wing. That's the difference between them. Males have significantly longer wings, but otherwise I can't tell them apart looking at them. So the bands really help to tell. And if any of you who are, working on birds and stuff and looking at birds on Mount Lemmon, and you see a Cordilleran that has any kind of band on it, please let me know. Contact me. You'll see my email's on this presentation, and it's on file, so you'll always have it there. So that's how we mark the birds and know the birds. And a large, I would say 80 to 90% of all the birds that we have worked on in our study areas are color banded. So we have some really good data on longevity and density of birds, looking at territorial patterns and movements like that. The insect collection we do, this is a malaise trap. It catches flying insects. These birds, 98% of its diet is flying insects, flies, diptera, beetles, flying beetles, mosquitoes. That's all they eat. They sally out and snap and take bugs on the flight. They don't glean like a lot of your warblers do. So what this trap does is it has 4 wings, and these wings go into the center part, and it goes up into a funnel up here, which goes into an insect collecting vial. And we collect those insects every 2 weeks from 3 traps, an average of traps, and we have a biomass level of flying insects. And these birds, if you look at the flying insect, you can look, and it's an exact same replica of the bird of abundance, breeding patterns, and they follow the insects absolutely perfectly in both Colorado and in Arizona, but that's another story. So the malaise traps gets us the insects, and this particular one, this back here is Turkey Run Road before the gate on the Forest Service land along Sabino Creek right here. And so we try to keep it in the riparian zone where it's most beneficial to these birds. The 2 study areas we worked at are very similar. They're both at 8,200 feet. They both have streams running through them. Here's Arizona. This has Sabino Creek down here on Turkey Run, and this is in Dolores, Colorado, by the East Fork of the Dolores River above Stoner. They're both fir and ponderosa pine. In dry areas, fir, spruce in the wet zones. The major difference is that Colorado tends to have way more aspen. There are aspen like this one right here in Arizona, but the main understory in Arizona is mountain maple, and mountain maple is very rare up in Colorado. That's the only difference. So you've got the elevations the same and everything. So the study areas that we're comparing here today are pretty similar. So now we'll get into some results here. The first thing I'd like to share with you is how we developed the nest box. So in Colorado, that if anybody's been up on that road to Telluride out of Dolores, that's a glaciated valley. So if you look at both sides, the walls go straight up like this, and it's flat bottom. And when we first got there in 2007, we didn't catch a single Western Cordilleran Flycatcher. And we have mist nets at both locations set up at standard locations where we record number of birds captured of all species per net hour. And by taking the size of the net and the duration of time it's up, you can calculate net hours, and then you can look back at how many birds of each species were captured. And so we see no Cordillerans at all. And we thought, well, maybe it's because we went to other areas up further where there were sedimentary rock along the stream, and there were Western Cordilleran Flycatchers there. So we did an experiment in 2010 where we set out 5 different types of nest platforms. This one up on the left here is a flat platform, that brown board right there under an old cabin. That's a flat one. We made 5 4-sided nest boxes like you use for chickadees and bluebirds and stuff, with a hole appropriate size for the Cordilleran. We had 3-sided nest boxes, completely open nest boxes, and the 2-sided nest box with a roof. This is the one the birds prefer to nest on. And so we've moved forward using, and you'll hear me use the term, 2-sided nest boxes. Here you have this information. These are all the basic materials. If you get a 1x8 or 1x6 board, you can make 2 platforms out of a board by alternating back and forth the different pieces. And these are the size of the pieces. And so this 2-sided one seems to be most appropriate one for the Cordillerans to choose to nest in. And so what we did was we set out these in Colorado, and we had an experiment where I was looking at polygamy, and we did 2 nest boxes close, 1 far away, and set out about 30 nest boxes up there, and got an idea of how they used them. And then when we moved to Arizona, the Boy Scouts made a bunch of these on Mount Lemmon and sold them to the residents who put them on their cabins. And we took some and put them out into our study area up on Turkey Run. So on Mount Lemmon, we have about 140 nest boxes now, or nest platforms out. And so if we look at Mount Lemmon, and we can look at substrate type used here, the nesting platforms are the aqua blue bars. The human habitations are gray bars, and the natural nest sites are pink bars. And so what we see, we started this project out in 2019 on Mount Lemmon, and we did not get a lot of use. We only had 2 birds in 19, 1 bird in 20 use nest platforms. And then in 23, they started picking up use, and you can see what happens with the pink bars. They're leaving the natural nest sites and choosing to use platforms over natural nest sites. And a lot of this delay and lag effect is that these birds will come back and nest in the same spot as long as they're alive. We got a 20% return rate every year, so you lose 80% of your birds. But as long as one of the color banded birds who nested at that location comes back, they nest at the same spot, at the same location, using a lot of times the same nest and fixing it up. And so they will stay using natural until we get a complete turnover of the birds. And then they'll start moving off and use alternate nest sites, which would be platforms in their territories. And this particularly happens early on if their eggs get predated. They'll move out of where they are and move over to a different nest site at a different location in the territory. And they'll find platforms there and use them there. So we see this increased use. And in fact, last year in 2024, 80% of the young produced on our study area on Turkey Run came off of platforms. And you'll see why in a minute, why platforms are beneficial to the species. So the let me go on here. So we then asked the question, was there any difference between breeding parameters between study sites for the birds on platforms? And was there any difference in platforms versus natural nest sites in aspects of breeding? And so the first one is clutch size, and we have about 450 clutch sizes here. And you can see the average is about 3.77. The modal is 4. They usually lay 4 eggs, but some lay 3, so it reduces the average on the clutch size. And you can see in Colorado it's 3.7. In Mount Lemmon, it's 3.2. That difference became only because of 2021, which was it was a real drought year up there, really influenced the breeding behavior. And actually the clutch sizes decreased that year because of the lack of food resources. The incubation period is how long the bird stays on the nest, is identical between Colorado and Arizona, and is identical between natural nest sites and platforms. The nestling period, the same way. You can see there's data there. The only difference here is that on platforms, birds tend to stay a little longer, actually significantly longer, about 3/4 of a day to a day. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with the stability of the substrate. You'll see that on a future slide here. And platforms influence nest stability. And this didn't seem important to me at first, but it really is an important parameter. The nest cavities are usually little cubby holes in the side of rocks and stuff. And what happens is, as long as the female's sitting on eggs, everything's fine. But what happens after the eggs hatch and the young get bigger, they tend to go out and move and sit on the edge of the nest and stand there to get fed. And because the crevice is so small, the nest actually tips out and falls out on the ground, and all the young are lost. We have 7 in Colorado and 9 on Mount Lemmon in natural areas that fell out in the nestling period stage. We had none fall out on platforms or on man-made structures. And so what this is a graph of the width of the nest base. I thought that was a good aspect of how big the nest is. And you can see on man-made structures, on beams and stuff, like above Mindy's head there on that beam, there's a, they can spread out the nest. So the nest base seems to be a little bit longer. On the platform, they also have, but they have a confined area, but it's big enough that the nest fills it. Whereas on natural nest sites, the nest bases are much, much smaller because the crevices are smaller, and that's why the nests are falling out. But what happens here, this platform base is large enough that nests, we have not recorded a single young falling out of a platform. So the nest platforms influence nest stability, and that helps. They also influence nest success, and this is the big thing. Initially, I had hypothesized, and I quit making hypotheses. Birds beat me to death. I had hypothesized that the main predators of these birds are avian predators, which are the corvid group. Steller's jays, ravens, crows, magpies in Colorado. And they're all aerial predators. The ground predators tend not to get these nests very much. And I had hypothesized that they would get a search image for the platforms and maybe predation would be higher on the platforms. And exactly the opposite is true. We found that the platform provides a more secure and safe breeding environment. And so here's your modal clutch size of 4 eggs. In a platform, those nests are fledging over 3.25 eggs. So 3.25 eggs go to fledge to young on platforms, whereas at natural sites, only 1.5 of those eggs make it to fledging. And so there's a huge difference in the number of young produced by platforms, and man-made structures are in between. And we feel that a lot of this has to deal with, I'm going to switch back for a minute to this, the roof that the platform provides. As the aerial predators fly over natural nest sites, they look down and there's 4 white eggs with little brown spots sitting in a brown cup, and boom, down on them they go. Whereas when they fly over the platform, they cannot see the eggs from the air. They have to come in from the side and look into it. And so what we have here, I believe anyway, is a little more security provided by the roof of the platform onto the eggs. And so what we're left with here is a huge difference in the number of young produced on platforms versus natural nest sites or man-made structures. And that, you can see, influences the overall productivity of the entire population. Here's the breeding success of Mount Lemmon from 2019 through this year, 24. Look at the gray bars. These are the number of young fledged. And you can see what happens here as they start using platforms more, the number of young fledged increase. So not, it's influencing at the population level, not only the individual nest platform level. Now, we also ask the question, what about adults? And so what we see here is, here we have maybe yes, maybe no. and it depends on the place. This is Colorado on the left graph here. And again, with our standard mist netting, this is not target netting for Cordillerans. This is standard mist netting, what we're catching. Early on, we had a 0. This is the percent of Cordilleran flycatchers or Western flycatchers captured in our mist nets and array. We didn't get any. And then when we put in the platforms here in 2012, we started catching them. And as this light blue bars show the number of copal captured, but this one is the percentage of copal of all birds. And a spike in increase as they used more and more platforms, more and more adults came in. So at the end of our study there in 2018, about 25% of the birds we were catching were Cordillerans, which is amazing. And on Mount Lemmon, where the birds are more saturated, and here there were very few birds because there weren't any nesting locations. We put in platforms and the birds came, adult numbers increased. In Mount Lemmon, this was not the case. The birds are saturated, and throughout the years and even into 2023 and 4, this continues to be at the same level. We did not influence adult numbers by using platforms on Mount Lemmon. Now, this species has a dispersal technique for young. Young do not come back to the natal area. And this year is the first year we've gotten young back, and we're finding they're moving 6 miles down the mountain to breed at other locations. Birds up near the summit will move down to Summerhaven, and birds that were bred at Summerhaven, or put it this way, the other way around, birds that were bred at Rose Canyon Campground move up to Turkey Run. I've got 2 that came up from Summerhaven this year. We don't have any going from Colorado to Arizona, but we got them moving around in Arizona pretty good. So the bottom line here is that in some areas that are low levels of numbers of Western flycatchers, you can also increase the adult population by using platforms. In those areas that have high numbers and densities of Cordillerans, the platforms will not alter the number of adult birds in that particular location. So, in summary, and I told you this wouldn't be very long. In summary, what we're seeing here is when we developed the platform, the 2-sided structure was actually the more suitable of all of the 5 different types we tried, and we've continued to use that platform. These platforms, we feel, provide a much more stable base than the natural nest cavities, where the nests will fall off of the substrates. We have a study area at the Boy Scout camp in Palisades, where the Forest Service Visitor Center is. There behind there down the hill, and that birds tend to nest in the tent platforms on 2x4s that are put up sideways, and that's not a very wide base. And that's where a lot of the nests had fallen off with the young when they get on bigger and stand on the edge, and boom, they fall right down to the ground. So they have a more stable substrate. The platforms actually decrease nest predation, we think, because of the roof hiding the eggs. And the increase in eggs, not predated, lets more young fledge, which then increases population productivity. And in certain locations, platforms can increase adult numbers, and others, it doesn't affect it at all. And one of the goals of this presentation today is hopefully the people at Tucson Audubon, who is well known for their conservation efforts on birds, look at your Virginia's warbler and your small raptor boxes you're putting out. You've really done a great job with that. And hopefully you can take these sorts of things. They're fairly easy to make, not as easy as Virginia warblers, but almost, and into your arsenal of conservation tools. And for example, the Chiricahua Mountains or some of the Sky Island areas, if someone has an interest down there, put these things up. And the territories are about 60 meters apart. So they are a type A territorial bird, which means they defended against everything else. So if you put 4 platforms up on your house, you're only going to get 1 Cordilleran. Doesn't matter how many platforms you have, because that Cordilleran is going to defend it against everybody else. So you have to space the boxes, the platforms out at about what would the average territory distance would be. And that's about 60 meters. again, another talk. And I really would like to thank you all, and particularly Danilo for hosting this, and all of you for listening in on this and listen to me pontificate on some of our research on Mount Lemmon and the Western Cordilleran Flycatcher. And you'll have my email here. I tend to use my personal email now rather than the university or other, because I spend more time at home than I used to. I used to spend a lot of time at the university. Now I spend it on a mountain or home. And so I have my email there and my phone number's there. Feel free to call me anytime you want. And I'd be more than happy to take any questions that you know.
I have a question about the Cordilleran Western. In other words, are all the Western flycatchers that you're looking at here in Tucson, are they all formerly the Cordilleran, and there aren't any other Western flycatchers?
All right, what happened initially was Ned Johnson at Berkeley did some genetic studies on the Empidonax and suggested that there were genetically different enough that the Pacific slope, which occurs in California, Oregon, up into Canada, into Vancouver, and the Sierra Mountains that go up to California, formed sort of a dividing line between that population and the Cordilleran. The picture I showed you of the distributional pattern, let me get back to it here, this one here. This is the Cordilleran Flycatcher. Okay. What used to be the Cordilleran is now considered Western Cordilleran Flycatcher. This is their distributional pattern. Over here, the Pacific slope goes up here. And so those of you who missed that, did use Peter Payton's book on the little maroon job that tells you what the birds are and the measurements. I dealt with a lot of not a lot, but the map station in Albuquerque, they kept saying, we're catching Western Pacific slope flycatchers. And I said, that's impossible, because our birds that are banded, and we know where they're going, drop down into the Rio Grande and go right through your banding station. and so, but we measured them, and it says that they were the rest. And then they made a rule that says if the bird's caught at low elevation on a stream, like in Tucson or Rio San Pedro, it's got to be a Pacific slope. If it's caught at high elevation, it has to be a Cordilleran. And that's not true at all. The Cordillerans do migrate down the Sierra Madres at higher elevations, but they also, occur at sea level in the wintertime down there. So a long-winded way, Mindy and Pam, to say that what we're seeing here is mostly Cordilleran flycatchers. If you lived in California on the coast, you would get mostly Pacific slope flycatchers. So I can't tell the difference. They say the vocalization is different. And if I listen real carefully, I can barely hear the difference. I'm doing some work with the Klamath Bird Observatory now, looking at all of their captures versus my captures at physical measurements and stuff, trying to tease out if there are any more differences. I measured all the birds from Colorado and from Arizona, and there wasn't a single morphometric difference between the two populations. Blew me away. Blew me away. I mean, they were almost identical. And so I don't have much of a hope about the physical measurements of it. But I would say if you see birds at your place here, they're probably Cordillerans. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, because I'm also in Washington sometime in the summers, and I've seen Pacific slope flycatchers there in the woods, up in the mountains, I think, mostly. So
absolutely.
I'm assuming the ones you're banding are all these Western Cordilleran flycatchers, but there's not any way to be absolutely sure, is what you're saying, it sounds like.
No, not unless we do more detailed genetic analyses, which
yeah, well,
Ethan isn't up for doing anymore.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so are we calling them Western flycatchers, or are we calling them Western Cordilleran flycatchers?
I call them Western Cordilleran Flycatchers, and I talked to the head of at the last meeting Estes Park, the American Ornithological Society had a meeting there. And the head guy of the committee, I talked to him and I said, now, it kind of sounds like these are all Westerns. And he said, no, that's not the case. He says, there's still the subspecies of Cordilleran versus the Pacific Slope.
Okay, got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's why I call them Western Cordilleran Flycatchers.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Dr. Van Riper, I have one.
Okay.
When you were doing the research on the nest boxes, did y'all find, is there a particular orientation that the birds prefer or a height off of the ground? Or are they just kind of happy with the nest box wherever it is, or platform, wherever it is?
Thank you. And I didn't set Danito up for this. We're doing an experiment up there now. This is going into the second year and trying to answer that exact question. So what happened was I looked at all the natural nest sites, the nest cavities, and I said, what's the average opening azimuth? Now, azimuth is 360 degrees in a circle. So every nest that we have, we put a compass on top of the nest and measure where is the opening facing. And the average was 180 degrees, which was south. So I'm telling everybody on Mount Lemmon, face your nest boxes toward the south. And it was absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. Well, what happened was I kept looking and I'm going, I don't have any nests facing 180 degrees. What's going on here? So I plotted out all the data and I had a bimodal distribution. So that means there were two peaks. You know, the normal curve that goes up, you have a big curve that goes up and down. That's a normal curve. This one had two curves, one on the left side and one on the right. And if you average them, it goes right into the middle, which is 180 degrees.
Wow.
And it was absolutely wrong.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, so what we've done is set up an experiment up there with nest platforms, and we have two nest platforms on each tree, and we have one facing the preferred direction, which is northeast. Okay, that's 50 to 70 degrees, and one in the worst direction, which is south, 180 degrees, 178 degrees. So if you ever drive up Turkey Run Road or go up the Ski Run Road toward the summit, look on the left and you'll see trees with two nest boxes on them,
Okay.
one facing the northeast and one facing the south. And last year they started using them and it was working wonderful until two birds decided they would nest in the south. And so blew my statistics and I couldn't say anything. This year, hopefully, but a long-winded way to say they hate the south because, again, because of the heat. And I'm using my temperature and weather pattern to measure northeast versus south temperatures so I can look at differences in temperatures between those boxes facing south and those facing northeast. I think they prefer the northeast and the southwest. Okay. In Hawaii, the birds preferred the southeast to get that early morning sun. But at least with the Western Cordilleran Flycatchers, the modal, which is the most common, is in the northeast. That's the way it faces. And it's really hard because there are lots of parameters that affect this, not only the way it faces, but how close are the trees that are adjacent to it, this sort of thing. What slope is it on? And I just couldn't measure all of those parameters. So we're trying in a simple experiment to see if we can answer that question, Danito. What's the best direction? So right now I'm telling everybody face northeast.
Perfect. Well, I'm excited to follow your research and find out. Hopefully you guys can find out an answer.
Yeah.
When should we look for the nesting Cordillerans, or when are they here in Mount Lemmon?
All right, they arrive on starting April 27th. But last year the spring was cooler and they came in later. So they came in the first week in May. So they spend the first week in May and the first 2 to 3 weeks in May setting up territories and defending in place. And they start nesting the last week in May through the first 2 to 3 weeks in June. So you start looking for your nests starting late May. That's when they'll start building.
Very
Okay.
cool. Yes.
If we want to see the birds, we might be able to see them at the end of April or the beginning of May flying around.
They should arrive in early May. Yes, flying around.
Okay, cool.
And I'll tell you, those first ones that come in, they're in deep kimchi. I mean, they just kind of sit by the stream and hunker down, and they are. I've caught in Colorado. I caught one that came in the first day. He weighed 7 grams. I don't know how he made it. He was a 12-gram bird.
Yeah.
Whoa.
Weighed 7 grams. But he made it. But they really get beat up on migration, and they come in and they're not flying around singing, doing great things the first couple days. So I'd wait for the end of the first week to the middle of May to watch them flying around.
Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, there are no other questions in the chat. I'll just make sure if anybody else has a question, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask Dr. Van Riper right now. As we're doing that, I will tell you, Dr. Van Riper, I know, Olya and Jenny do a lot of our nest box work, and they were both out in the field today, but they both specifically made sure I was going to record this because they want to watch it. And, basically, according to your charts, I mean, y'all basically doubled the successful number of eggs using those nest boxes. So that's really, really impressive. So I know they're very interested in it.
That was a surprise to me. As I said before, I predicted they lose more because of the search image of the corvids on the nest platforms. And over the last 17 years, that hasn't been the case. So
yeah, it's amazing. Susan has a question from the chat. We talked about when they come and establish their nests. When will the Western Cordillerans leave our area?
Okay. The Cordillerans can produce one set of young per year, period. They will renest, but they only produce one set of young each year. And that is because they have such a long nesting period. They set up their nest, their whole nesting period is 45 days from when they start laying eggs to when the young leave the nest. They're only here for 60 days.
Oh.
Okay, so if they get predated early, they can renest and have a successful nest. But I will tell you, this year, the insect numbers started decreasing early. And in the second week in July, I saw birds moving down the mountain that were banded, that I know had nests up higher and were breeding, and they weren't breeding anymore. They were going to Mexico. I'm going, where are these birds going so early? At the 4th of July is a good thing. If you lose your nest after the 4th of July, kiss it off. They just migrate out.
Okay.
Before the 4th of July, from May, June, and into July, if you can maybe get your renesting done. So the birds leave. This year they left in the middle of July, but most of the time they leave the second to third week, or the 3rd to the 4th week in July, and into early August. By the first week in August, 10th of August, 7th of August, there are no breeding Cordillerans left on Mount Lemmon. So they're leaving most of the time in late July into the very first part of August. And a lot of this has to deal with the monsoons, when the monsoon stops, and the abundance of flying insects. Because when those flying insects stop, boom, the birds are gone. They're tied very closely to their food resource up there. So if you want it, again, a long-winded way to say, birds leave late July, starting the 3rd week in July, 2nd to 3rd week in July, into very early August, and then by early August they're gone from Mount Lemmon.
That's really fascinating too. Again, talking about Jenny McFarland, she just had a blog post this past week talking about her elegant trogon surveys. And again, like you were saying, how closely tied they are to those insects and the previous year's monsoon.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's going to be, with our kind of weak monsoon this year, it'll be interesting to see kind of what the numbers do. We have one more question in the chat. I know people are about to get going. Are there any boxes on Forest Service Road 651? I believe this is supposed to say in the Penaleños. There's kind of a little bit of a, I don't know if you can see the chat yourself, but it says, are there any boxes on Forest Service Road 651 in the Pinels out of, and that's all I've got. But are you only working on Mount Lemmon, or are you in any other of our Sky Islands here in Southeast Arizona?
Oh, I'm at the present time, I'm only working on Mount Lemmon, and it's
Okay.
I've lost all my postdocs and grad students, so it's really tough to keep going up there, recapturing the birds and keeping them color banded. I would really like to get out, and that's why one of the goals of this presentation is hopefully we can get some effort made to put some of these platforms in some of the other Sky Islands. And
Okay.
I'd love to see that, but it's not mine. I didn't put that box up there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, let's see. There's no more questions in the chat. If everybody else is satisfied, I always, well, one quick thing before we wrap up. I will, again, like I said, we recorded this a little bit later this afternoon. I have to have a little bit of time to upload it onto YouTube, but I'll reach back out to everybody that registered today. I'll just kind of recap today's presentation. I'll CC Dr. Van Riper on it, so that way you'll have his email address, and then I'll have a YouTube link to today's presentation. So that way, like I said, you can go back and view it. And like I said, always, yeah, go ahead, Dr. Price, go ahead.
Oh, just one more question. I met you, Dr. Van Riper, once on Turkey Run Road. And so I was just wondering if we go up there again, when might you be there?
April 27th. I set up the Malays traps in early April, usually in the snow, but I have to collect data for that 2-week period at the end of April. So I'll be up there in early April on and off, and after April 27th, I'll be there full time through when they leave.
Wow. So are you there like certain part of the day, and could somebody like help you with whatever setup you're doing?
Sure. If you any like Linda and Chris Hansen helped last year somewhat with some of the banding. And early in the morning when I miss net, I don't miss net every day, but yes, setting up nets and doing that can help a lot. If you know how to miss net, that could use that help.
My husband might be able to help. I don't think I can.
Yeah, anytime you see me, feel free to stop and say hi. And I'm usually out in the morning and entering data in the afternoon.
Uh-huh. But when you're entering data, you're somewhere else, I'm assuming.
I go to my cabin up there. It's the first on Guthrie, right off of Turkey Run.
Oh, you have a cabin right there.
Yeah, so that's where I stay all summer.
Oh,
I got
cool.
from Tucson.
Awesome.
Yeah, it sounds nice.
Temperature's much nicer.
Yeah.
Okay, hope to see you. So spring, hopefully.
Thank you, Danilo, and thank you everyone for listening to me, and I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Yeah, this has been absolutely wonderful, Dr. Van Riper. And yeah, if anybody's still online, I always like to ask people at this time, go ahead, unmute yourself. Please say thank you, show our appreciation for Dr. Van Riper's time. I know some of you, I've seen some in the chat. A lot of our presentations are kind of photography centric, and I am not a photographer, so I tend to glaze over during those. And so getting on something a little more science forward, dealing with birds, this is absolutely been a pleasure for me, Dr. Van Riper. I really appreciate you being here and sharing this information with us.
Oh, thank you for allowing me to share it. Have a great day, everybody.
Absolutely. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.